Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for our forum conversation on concussions and youth. I'm David Gillette from Twin Cities Public Television, and we are coming to you tonight from Health Partners Corporate Headquarters in Bloomington, Minnesota. For the next while, we're going to have an in-depth conversation about concussions. We're going to talk about what they mean to the student athletes who experience them, and hopefully learn a little bit more about the science. Now, as you can see, there are a lot of young people joining me here tonight, several young athletes, many of whom have experienced concussions, and they have agreed very bravely to share their stories with us tonight. So thank you for being here, you guys. I really appreciate it. Also in the front of the room, we have some medical professionals and experts in the field who are going to be our tour guides tonight. They're really going to help us understand what has become a pretty complicated issue. So does it sound good?
Sounds wonderful.
Sounds wonderful.
Okay,
yep.
The format tonight is going to be pretty loose. I'm going to lead a conversation back and forth. We are going to hear a lot of personal stories, very important stories, and then excerpts from these conversations will be part of a Twin Cities Public Television documentary that's going to debut on Tuesday, October 8th, right after the Frontline special on concussions in the NFL. So I think we should get started. Enough introductions. But let's start by introducing our experts here in the front. To my immediate right, no, I got all this stuff written on the card. You don't have to worry. You can just sit here and listen to me talk about you right now. So Dr. Matthew Hofkens, he is a Health Partners physician specializing in physical medicine and rehabilitation. He focuses on non-operative sports medicine, including concussions. He's also a team physician to several local high schools, which we'll talk about later. And he was recently appointed to the State of Minnesota Traumatic Brain Injury Advisory Council. Let's clap for him tonight. Thanks for making time back, Hofkens. And then to my far right, we have Dr. Aynsley Smith. She is a research director in the Sports Medicine Center at Mayo Clinic. She's an associate professor in orthopedic surgery and physical medicine and rehabilitation at Mayo Clinic College of Medicine with a focus on sports psychology. She's also the co-chair of the Minnesota Hockey Education Program and the work towards fair play rule changes, which we'll also talk about a little bit later. Let's give her a round of applause for being here. Okay. Let's back up and start right at the beginning. I mean, everyone's heard of concussions. It's a big thing in the news right now. But elaborate for me. It's a bump on the head. Give me a better scientific definition than that.
Definition of a concussion. I'd be happy to. I mean, you know, a concussion is a traumatic injury without radiological evidence, and it can be anywhere really in the body.
Radiological evidence.
So no MRI findings, no CT findings. It's really a biomedical or a biomechanical disruption of brain function. So it's brain dysfunction, not an anatomy picture or a bleed or something else. So I think that sometimes people will use the word, oh, he suffered a head injury. That's an umbrella of many other injuries, and concussion is concluded into that sequela of a head injury.
Okay, so Dr. Smith, how can a concussion occur? I mean, we all have the vision of someone falling and hitting their head, but it doesn't have to be just head impact, does it?
No, there's a lot of different ways, and it's when the brain tissue kind of gets thrown forward sometimes against the skull, and also if somebody takes an elbow to the head and the head spins and the brain is injured that way with sort of like a stretching, I think, of the neurons, the axons. So there's a number of ways, and also it doesn't always have to be just one big blow. A series of blows, these repetitive head injuries can sort of add up. So for these kids, they probably each have a very different story that they're going to tell us about.
I've heard the analogy used before of an egg, and sort of the brain is the inside of the egg, and then the skull is the shell. Is that is that too simple, or is that appropriate?
I think it's good.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a simple analogy, but I think that it underlines a big point of what we're really talking about, of what's inside, and what we're trying to protect, and what we're talking about is the inside part of the egg. Doesn't mean that we don't care about the shell, but it does mean that we're talking about the inside, and it's a helpful understanding, I think, to the general public of why maybe a strategy or a injury or a hit to somewhere in the body might actually disrupt the actual inside of the egg versus having to have directly been hit on the skull to cause a fracture or something like that. Very hard to get a skull fracture with getting hit in the body, but certainly you could disrupt the yolk or the egg white with getting hit from a lot of vibration.
I've read a few reports that make it sound like concussions are becoming more frequent. And I'm wondering, do you think that concussions are more common today, or are we more focused on identifying concussions?
I think that big picture, I truly think that there's probably about a similar incidence overall of concussions that's been going on in the past several decades. I think that our recognition of and creation of a diagnosis and being more aware of the diagnosis has increased almost exponentially. So I think that that's a false misrepresentation of truly increased incidence. I just think that we're getting a little bit more aware, and that's due to a lot of hard work by people like Dr. Smith, all of these kids here and their awareness stories that's happened in the culture change over the past decade.
Great.
You know, one other perspective, within sport itself, so many of the players, you know too, have gotten so big and so fast. And so in that regard, I think sometimes that we're seeing more head trauma, for, definitely in the pro sports and D1, even junior hockey. The kids are coming in with between 0 and 7 concussions before they've even started playing junior hockey sometimes. So I think, but you're absolutely right, the number that are recognized now and discussed, and the care that's taken, and that the kids are taken, you know, kept at home and not to go to school. So there's so much more awareness, but it's hard to actually put your hand on the numbers since only 50% are reported, and it's
Yeah, I think it's a really tricky, it's a
Yeah.
real tricky conversation of true or not. You know, certainly maybe a slight elevation overall in incidence due to just bigger, faster, stronger athletes, but the vast majority, the exponential change of concussions diagnosed in the state of Minnesota, for example, is mostly identification with some predication to just bigger, faster, stronger kids, and potentially earlier involvement of children in sports too. I mean, I think that's another topic of when and different leagues, but that's certainly a possibility.
Yeah, you know, in just a minute we're going to get to some of these personal stories, but I did want to ask, our focus today is on youth and young athletes, and I wanted to ask, are concussions different for young people? Is the impact, is the diagnosis, is there a difference between young and older athletes?
Yes. The problem is that the little kids that are getting concussed haven't really formed all their connections and so on, and so they've got these little immature brains, and if at that time they're concussed, I think it just makes forming those pathways more difficult. You know, the connections aren't there for them. So they are at higher risk, and then proportionately there's a lot of head mass and a lot of brain relative to a little body. But I was also just going to add before we leave the previous topic too, that with the girls, there's so many more young women in sport now too. And when we talk about the prevalence of concussion, these kids now are playing hockey, they're on the basketball courts, they're playing soccer, and we haven't really got all of the differences between boys taking concussions and girls, the gender differences sorted out. So that also may contribute to the increase in numbers.
Okay.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with the age difference. It's one of the few things that we truly know when there's consensus among many experts is that adolescents or younger athletes take longer to recover. And Dr. Smith kind of focused on some of the potential biomechanical or pathological reasons why that's a possibility, but without question, in a clinical founding, it takes longer for children and adolescents to become more asymptomatic than maybe a professional athlete or a collegiate athlete that you see in their 20s. And I think that's a huge take-home message because the vast majority of concussions that we do see in the media and that we'll see on a day-to-day basis and hear stories about are in adults. And in adults that have chosen a profession or made a conscious choice, an adult sparing choice to say, I want to do this. Whereas many of the concussions that we're going to hear about throughout my life and throughout all the panelists here are in younger athletes that maybe aren't going to play professional sports or play collegiate sports, but the impact is great.
Sure. Well, let's use that as our transition point and start to hear some stories. We have a lot of student athletes here tonight, and I think Grant Olson was going to be our first volunteer. So Grant, you want to raise your hand so the audience can see you right over here in the corner? Here's Grant. He's been raring to go. All right, Grant, stand up. Your turn in the spotlight. We want to hear your story, Grant. So why don't you start by just telling us when you experienced concussions, what sport you were playing. Give us background on your personal experience.
All right. Well, I'm a senior right now. My first and actually only concussion, unlike some of these people over here. I was wrestling in 9th grade, my freshman year, and it was like probably my 5th or 6th year wrestling. So I was pretty used to it. Didn't think anything was going to happen to me. Wrestling at Blaine High School, we had a meet in Princeton, and so we got to Princeton. My match was up, wasn't too nervous. Kid came up, and when we were wrestling, when one of his first takedowns, he picked me up and slammed me down on this part of my head. And so in doing that, I kind of like took a break, was a little dazed. The trainer came out and held up his fingers, and he's like, "How many fingers am I holding up?" I'm like, 2. So he's like, "Do you want to keep wrestling?" Of course, I want to keep wrestling, yeah. And so I kept wrestling, and I was doing all right. And then later during the same match, when you're wrestling, you can cross-face with an open hand, but not with a fist. And the kid just started punching my jaw. And so I took a few of those, and then I started bleeding because I had braces at the time. So the ref stopped it and noticed I was holding my head. So the trainer came back down, and he was like, "How many fingers am I holding up this time?" I was like, 3. He's like, "Do you want to keep wrestling?" Yeah. So I kept wrestling. The ref noticed a few times that I was just like grabbing my head or whatever during the during the same match. So he's like, "If you grab your head again, I'm gonna pull you out." So we were wrestling a minute longer, maybe. Grabbed my head again, just subconsciously, and they pulled me, and I had to forfeit the match.
Okay, well, thank you for telling that story, and stay standing because I'm not done with you yet. But just from the expert perspective, was this enough of a diagnostic tool? I mean, it's easy to criticize in hindsight, but did the coaches and stuff do enough in this setting? What would have been the appropriate action considering Grant's experience?
I mean, so I think that we'll talk a little bit more about assessment tools. I mean, at some point maybe in the rest of the show. When I think the biggest thing to take away from anything here is that observation's huge. So of observation of every athlete. I spend so much time on sidelines looking at athletes and seeing a difference, seeing a change. So understanding one of the symptoms, which in Grant's case obviously was his headache, and trying to intervene and having a mechanism of injury, which obviously occurred too. Those two things together are basically enough to diagnose a concussion currently, and it was probably back in 3 years ago as well, from the knowledge that we know. And so really I think assessment tool aside, observation is an assessment tool. And I think sometimes we get a little carried away with not relying on, oh, well, there's a new test or how many fingers or a new international test has come out. They are very helpful when an obvious concussion doesn't occur. But in Grant's situation, to me, retrospectively, it seems like, yeah, he had a headache, he had a mechanism of injury, he had a concussion.
Should have been time to stop wrestling at that point.
The time is done, yeah.
Okay, so Grant, what has been your experience since then? I know people have different symptoms in an ongoing fashion. What's your life been like since this experience?
Well, it's been 3 years since 3 years in January since that happened, and since then, the initial 2 weeks that that I had been just kind of handling the concussion after wrestling, I was just pretty much asleep the whole time. Like, I remember I woke up, I set my alarm one morning, woke up, and it was like the second day after, and I was like, I'm not going to let this get me down. I'm going to go to school. So I went to school for like a third hour, and I was like, all right, so I'm here. And I was at school, and my teacher gave us some paper to do, and it was on yellow paper, and I called my mom. I was like, Mom, I got to go home. This yellow paper's got a glare, and it's just killing my headache.
Oh, wow.
So it was just weird. I couldn't stand it. Like, I've always been able to tough out pain pretty well, but I'm just like, I can't overcome these headaches. But the rest of those 2 weeks after I had the concussion, it was just like I slept the whole time, woke up to eat occasionally, not that many times. What would you say, like 3 times in the week or in the few weeks?
Sleep and headaches.
Sleep and headaches.
Yeah, I didn't wake up all that much, and yeah, fatigue's still a problem for me. Headaches are still a problem for me. Forgetting things is also a big problem. So.
Okay, so obviously a lot of red flags there with follow-up symptoms. He was identifying these himself. what ideally should someone like Grant be doing at this point? I mean, is it time for intensive rest, or what is the correct approach when these symptoms are reappearing?
You know, I do think that the current wisdom right now is to still try to have the patients be asymptomatic, but there's some, that's not, everybody doesn't believe that. There's also some criticism that we're taking young athletes who are very fit, very used to competing and so on, and we're having them suffer the complete withdrawal of that regular exercise. And so there's a Dr. Leddy out in New York who's starting to exercise a little earlier, but he still wants to see it's the WHO, the World Health Organization, their list of symptoms. He wants to see the patient have 2 or 3 or less. And then if that's true, then he's starting them on an earlier protocol. So I know right now you're still having these same symptoms now?
Yeah, fatigue's been going down since I started working out, but yeah.
Exactly. And the kids make so much sense, patients make so much sense, and I know you agree with that. And you know, when the concussion first happens, all that metabolic cascade stuff, you know, the potassium and the calcium clogs up the little mitochondria. Those are the little energy cells, right? Little energy centers in the cell. And you can't produce your ATP, your energy that you need. And so we see when we give this little profile of mood states to say, how do you feel? We'll see high tension, high depression, high anger and frustration, 0 on energy, high fatigue and high confusion. And with our other injured athletes like ACLs and a lot of the other kids, shoulder dislocations, we still see energy up, you know, about 20 or something, but these other mood scales may be elevated. But that concussion, I think your parents and everybody would agree, they just are like 0 energy, aren't they? It's sound familiar? Yeah.
I mean, I think Dr. Smith, you know, touches on a lot of great points. I certainly think that we're trying to objectify subjective symptoms. And obviously what I mean by that is these are things that you can't just put on a scale. There's not a lab test. There's not a number. And so Grant specifically is having symptoms. He had symptoms from the start. I and many healthcare providers try to objectify that by saying, you know, let's get a number to that. We're passionate about doing that, not because we think it's going to make Grant feel better. So we're trying to track progress. We're trying to track and say, are there certain symptoms that we can target to try to at least improve those symptoms? Because if you can improve maybe a nidus symptom for Grant, obviously it sounds like his headaches, and if that can be improved, then yeah, we can advance some of the other activities that are kind of secondarily causing Grant problems. So this isolation, this energy fatigue, all these other things kind of going into that. So it's a every concussion is different. We try to objectify those subjective symptoms by using grading scales that I routinely use, and anyone else that manages concussions kind of have to use to show, to say, are we making a difference or are we not? Is there something that we tried, did that make you better or worse? And so that's why healthcare providers do that so much to that parent and to that kiddo, because we're trying to figure out, is this working or is it not? Because we'll try something else.
Sure.
Every concussion's different. They're kind of like snowflakes. I mean, it's true. They're all different,
all right.
And they really need to be kind of manipulated depending on and tailored to the care of that specific athlete.
Well, speaking of all concussions being different, let's get another personal story now. Michelle Jensen? Michelle? Okay, you're up next. The lights are on you, Michelle. Tell us your concussion story.
I was in gym class and we were playing basketball, and then I heard a kid say, "Watch out," and then the basketball hit me. I was acting weird, and I went to a friend, and then she brought me to the gym teacher. He asked me if I was okay, and I said yes, and he asked if I wanted to go to the nurse. And every kid is going to say no because they don't want to be a wimp. So I said no, and I went on with the day, went to the hallway with ice and my friends, and I went back to class. I went to dance that day, did everything in dance, went home early from dance. I went to school the next day, made it till lunch, and I texted my mom that the lights and sounds were hurting. Then I got
Similar
sent
to what Grant experienced with the yellow paper. Okay.
Then I got sent home.
Okay. And how's your life been since this? Have you had recurring symptoms? Have you been able to recover? What's your life been since then?
My headaches never go away, and I have symptoms every day.
Do people tend to believe you when you tell them this? Because I know there's still sort of a stigma around concussions. How do people react to your headaches and what you're feeling?
Most kids think I'm faking. That's why I stick with my friends.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing your story. I appreciate it. Let's talk about the stigma there. Most people think I'm faking. Why is that? If you have a torn knee, people don't give you a hard time. Why is there such a stigma around concussions?
I really think it comes back to objective versus subjective things, right? It's like objective things that we can see, we can feel, we can hear. These are not concussion symptoms. There are some concussion symptoms that are a little bit more objectifiable, and balance problems, things like that. Actually, just having like a stupor. I mean, we all can see that, but that's not what we're really talking about here in terms of all of these kids that are having prolonged symptoms. So they're silent. They're hard to see. I see a stigma in so many ways. I see a stigma of people not believing, and then I see a stigma of people trying to avoid getting caught that they have a concussion. I see a stigma of...
Is that the not wanting to be a wimp?
Well,
effect
not
that we
being,
talked
yeah,
about?
like, yeah, not being want to be a wimp, and then saying, well, we don't, if I do this and I'm a motivated athlete and I somehow get caught that I have a concussion, then I can't play and I won't get my scholarship, so that's the problem. So that's the total opposite side. Someone like her is coming out and saying, I really am having these troubles, someone help me. And people are saying, well, we don't believe you. And then there's the athlete that says, we really want to help you, but I don't want to be helped. And so, wow, what kind of position are we in there? That's a cultural nightmare that we have, and we're making slow erosions on both sides, I think.
Yeah. And on the other end of the continuum, for coaches, there's a difficulty sometimes because some kids don't want to play in the heat of the battle on a football team or on a hockey team, and they may sort of feign injury when it isn't it's hard to validate that they are as injured, and some kids can get a reputation as being kind of wussy or just not ready to put it all out there. So I think there's sort of a whole spectrum of reasons why one is trying to sometimes avoid seeming like a wimp, and other times they're, wishing that they could be left alone.
Well, Michelle, let me ask you, because you're one of the brave ones who agreed to be on camera, and I know there's all the lights and stuff tonight. What do you want your fellow students to know from your experience? What are you hoping others will learn?
That just because you can't see it on the outside doesn't mean you actually hurt on the inside.
Okay, and what are your hopes for the future? Are you hoping to get over this? Are you hoping to educate other folks? What are you really feeling today?
I hope I educate people, and I hope I get over everything.
Okay, well, we wish you the best. Thank you so much for sharing your story. I appreciate it.
Yeah. There's a professor in kinesiology that has had some major issues, just like you're talking about, and she felt at times that her healthcare providers got so frustrated because they were trying to help her get better, and I see the parents all nodding, and she desperately wanted to, but when the treatments that were being ordered and so on weren't helping, everybody just got so frustrated, and she had to seek healthcare somewhere else. And we're just beginning, there's all this vestibular rehabilitation, there's all sorts of things that we're just beginning to learn about, and maybe the answers are going to be somewhere there. But right now, there are limits to what we can do, aren't there?
Yeah, I've routinely, I wish I didn't have to say the word routinely, but there's been many patients that we've done everything that I know. I've been very frank with the patient. I've been very frank with the loved ones of saying, I don't think I'm helping you, and I wish I could. It doesn't mean that I don't want to help you, but I don't know if by coming to me and spending 30 minutes, am I wasting your money and I'm wasting your time? And I think that, I know that happens in other conditions. I know that happens with some of my orthopedic colleagues, with people that want to have a surgery on their shoulder, and we just can't, and we just think that shoulder is going to make them worse if we have that surgery. And I think there are limits to healthcare, and I want there to not be limits to healthcare. I want to be able to help every person I can. But I do think that there needs to also be that direct communication with healthcare provider, athlete, patient, family, of basically saying, I'm worried that we're not making progress. I wish I wasn't. I wish that wasn't the answer. But I do think that those patients that I've had that conversation with, I think they've been quite thankful that at least they had some closure, that I was actually not just saying, well, then do something else, go somewhere else. I think there's been some good of that, but it is very difficult.
I want to transition just a little bit and talk more exclusively about the risks and dangers of repeat concussions. And Matt is here tonight. And Matt, it says on my card here, you've suffered 9 concussions. Yep. Is that true? Can you stand up and tell us your story, Matt?
I suffered 9 total documented concussions. I had 4 more serious ones. 2 of them, which were my first 2, happened in 4th grade. Both of those were football. The first hit was probably the hardest hit out of the 9, and I think that kind of played into why I got so many more repeated concussions. Just it'd always be easier to get them. So I had 2 in 4th grade. I had 2 in 6th grade, which were in basketball. And then from there, it was about 3 years until I had my next one. And then I had a couple throughout high school and ended up with my 9th one in senior year basketball.
So what has it done to you in your life? Have you had trouble with schoolwork? Have you had some of the symptoms we've heard about from others?
I've had a lot of headaches, fatigue, dizziness towards the right after the hit, just usually for a couple of weeks. A lot of behavioral changes, and all of this adds into each other. And I'd have emotional changes. I was depressed, anxious, confused. I didn't really know why I was suffering this 180 personality change. Behavioral, I guess very impulsive is how I would describe it. I would react a lot to teachers if they weren't helping me the way I needed or didn't believe me, which was also
So you're running into the same stigma of people not believing your symptoms?
That was a while ago, for me at least. I haven't experienced that as much nowadays. With my professors at the U, they have all been very understanding and helpful. Growing up through middle school, early high school, I had some issues getting the teachers on board. And early on, a big reason was that we couldn't explain it to them. We didn't know too much because we weren't told that much. But as the years went on, we were told more and more, and we were able to relay that onto the teachers and get the whole school not the whole school, but everybody behind us that we needed. So
Sure. If I heard this right, it sounded like you thought your first injury when you were younger was the most severe, or at least when you had the hardest impact. Have you found in your own experience that you feel like you maybe are more susceptible to concussions since that first injury? I mean, it sounds like the big hit was when you were young, and maybe the ones since then weren't as severe.
I think that definitely played into it. I had 2 within a month in 4th grade, and then 6th grade I had 2 within 3 months. And I think the fact that those are so close together really amplified the concussion before that, and I think it would make it easier to get. Sure. I kind of compared it to a sprained ankle, where I sprain it once, a bad sprain, and then later on, a couple years later, months later, then I would sprain it again, and it would just be easier and easier.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing your story, Matt. I really appreciate it. Is there any science to that? Is that a truth, that once you have a concussion, you're more susceptible in the future?
Yes, it is. We do know it, but I think you're about 4 to 6 times greater risk of a second concussion if you've had the first concussion. And the actual number of sort of days, or the length of the time period in between, is thought to be concerning. You know, you really don't want that second hit because of the second impact syndrome that doctor can explain a little more if you want it. We are working with the University of Minnesota in the lab looking, and one of the things that we're doing in this partnership is looking at a little neuron and seeing how it responds to trauma, and then how it responds with very close impacts coming right after another. And they're looking at that, you know, at a laboratory level, but it's a long way from, you know, helping us with this. But
so why do we see the impacts from these repeat injuries? Is it like when you get a bruise, the bruise is more sensitive and you have to give it time to heal? I mean,
well, I think the short answer is, yeah, I think that's certainly a theory. The short answer is we really aren't 100% sure as to why people are more susceptible, but we are sure that they are. So like if you took statistics and said, you know, the last decade, what what is the biggest risk factor for getting a concussion is a prior concussion. That is the number one risk factor. It's more than playing sports. It's more than, that is your biggest risk factor. We know that. It's a risk factor. We don't know exactly why it's a risk factor on a microscopic level, or at least I'm not exactly sure, and I don't think there's a lot of agreement on as to why. I think that one of the interesting things that Matt brought up is talking about hits, and was the first hit the biggest, and then the subsequent hits are less, there's maybe less force, and they maybe cause a concussion. I mean, one thing we're trying to do is that we've improved, and I think that we will continue to improve, is make sure that people are actually ready to put themselves in harm's way again. That's ongoing, and that's getting better. So that will help that problem to some degree. And then the eyes are somewhat are deceiving, I think. We just talked about the biomechanics of how concussions happen. We talked a little bit about why maybe you get hit in the chest and you might have a concussion, or you get hit in a basketball and that one might be worse than, oh my goodness, I just saw this huge hit on the sidelines and that kid is fine. There's a lot of variables that go into what is happening on a microscopic level, the time of the day, hormone things, just the situation, the bracing before an impact, all these things that go into what actually causes brain dysfunction. And I think a lot of times I'll see, that was a huge hit and that kid's fine, and this one was nothing, and then that's no big deal. That's just we gotta stop that. We have to stop the idea of, oh, my eyes saw it was a big hit, so that kid's hurt, but this one was not a big hit and that kid's not hurt. We just know, and we're moving away from that and saying, actually the biggest predictor, the best predictor of how severe a concussion is not if they lost consciousness, it's not if they, wow, they fell down. It's what are their initial symptoms, and how long in that first couple of days, how bad is their symptoms. That's what's gonna predict how severe that concussion is.
Let's get another story. Hannah. All right, Hannah, you're up. You know the drill. We want to hear your story. It says here on my card, 4 concussions.
4 concussions. Yes, 4 concussions in a short time, too. My first one was in a soccer game. I got checked from behind, and it was my recovery game after an ankle injury, so I wasn't that stable, and I just went down. I was really dazed and confused. I actually had to ask a teammate what position I played, and I'd been playing this for years, so I should have known it, but I kept playing for the rest of the game, and I laid down on the ground for the whole next game. My parents took me to the ER. I got cleared within a couple of days, went back to practice and games, got another concussion. Then got cleared again, went to basketball season, and I got tripped and hit my head on the ground, and that one was a lot worse. It was a lot of vomiting, and it took a lot more time to recover and a lot more symptoms, but I got over it within a couple weeks and was cleared to go back to sports. And the last one was March 20th, 2011. I was playing soccer in a gym, and the ball hit me in the side of the head, and I fell backwards and hit my head on the gym floor.
Shoot. So what have your symptoms been going forward? I mean, as you continue to be a student and a young person, what have you experienced in the last few years since that last injury?
The first couple months, I never went back to school because I was just in and out of the ER on drugs, didn't know what was happening. So I never went back to my 8th grade year. My 9th grade year, I went to school full-time for the first 2 weeks and then was hospitalized. So I was taken out of school, went to 1 class for the rest of the year. 10th grade, about 2 classes, and this year 2 classes. But headaches and dizziness and nausea, fatigue, memory issues. And I actually got cluster headaches afterwards, so that's been a big...
What does a cluster headache mean?
It's like kind of like a step up from a migraine. It like feels like...
There's a step up from migraines? There's something above migraines? I didn't even know that existed.
Yeah. It like feels like your eyes like burning and somebody's like poking it in. I don't know.
So what you've heard, the question I've asked other folks here today, what would you tell other young people who are maybe in sports today? What would be your message based on the tough road you've had the last few years?
That a concussion's a brain injury, and it should be treated like that.
Okay, well, thank you so much for sharing your story. I really appreciate it. That sounds like a really tough road. I mean, we're missing a lot of school, a lot of real severe pain, the headaches above migraines, which I just learned about.
Don't get them.
Don't get them. I hope not to. That really actually sounds awful. I admire you for toughing that out. But so how common is this level of experience? Is this at the extreme end of symptoms, or are there lots of kids out there who might watch this and have this same experience?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, another great message, I think, from a forum like this. I mean, if we're really talking about concussions and sport-related concussions, I do want to emphasize that every athlete that's here, or every story that we're here, are certainly on a spectrum, and they're on a spectrum of prolonged recovery, and they're here for that reason. This is something that has been a huge change in their life. We haven't heard everyone's story yet. We're one short, I think. But so I don't want to bite. I don't want to bite my tongue here. But I mean, the vast majority of sport-related traumatic brain injuries in this state and in this country and in the world are much better outcomes than this. They're not 2 years of prolonged symptoms. They're not, missing school, years of school, missed 8th grade. It certainly is all too common in this population. It's all too common in my clinic. But it's not. I don't want people watching this or tuning in on a webinar to say, boy, every sport-related traumatic brain injury is going to involve me being out of missing my 8th grade. I think that's the wrong message. The message specifically for athletes, I think, is wonderful. Is that if something happens, it's serious. Don't just shuttle it inside. Tell someone about it. Doesn't mean that your life is going to be changed forever. But the earlier we can get to these folks, and the earlier we can try to make a difference, the more we can hopefully prevent from being a 1-week recovery and keeping it at that versus a 7-month recovery. And those are the athletes we're trying to reach out to all the time. That's the athlete I'm trying to reach out to every single day to try to avoid a prolonged recovery.
You were nodding a lot. You agree with that?
I do. I absolutely do. There's just so many kids that are in the system and out so quickly and back, to play, where both the physician and the patient and the parents think that the youngster's ready to go. And so that's by far the majority. On the other hand, these are still so serious that when these kids are dealing with what they are, those outcomes are tough for them, the academic consequences and so on. And so working on prevention is a huge piece.
Sure.
And we're doing a lot of work with that. We can talk about it later, but it's just so critical.
Well, you're right. We have one more story here, and then
Yeah,
I want to get into the
absolutely.
guidelines around return to play in just a moment. So
Absolutely.
Olivia, who's down here at the end? Okay, Olivia. I don't even think I have to set you up anymore. You heard the drill. I want to hear your story as well. 3 concussions on the card, apparently.
5 documented concussions.
Oh, really? Okay.
But a lot more since then. My first one was in 8th grade. I was in soccer. I got tripped and I landed right on top of my head. The second one, I was out for only 2 days from school, and then I came back. I was cleared. They said I had a minor concussion, but we later learned it was kind of bigger than that because I still had symptoms. My grades went down just a little bit, but then I started to get back. And then during the winter of that year, I was pushed into a cement wall during gym head first. That one was really bad. I was out for a while, I guess. I blacked out, and I was carried up in a wheelchair. But I was out of school for a month or 2. I went back to school. We discovered that my grades went from A's to like D's and F's. And I started seeing a neurologist, and they put me on a lot of medicine, which didn't help me a lot. They just made me really foggy and disoriented. And then 9th grade year came around, and we started getting back into the groove of things, still on some medications that made me out of things. And then I hit my head again where I was in gym class and someone kicked a soccer ball right on the side of my head. I was out for about 3 months that year. And then that spring of 9th grade year, my sister slammed a door on my head, which wasn't that nice. But
On purpose?
Yeah, but she was like 4.
Okay.
So
we'll give her a pass on that.
we will. Maybe when she's later, we'll give her grief. But she slammed the door. That one was really bad, too. I started puking. I was rushed to the ER right away, and I had to get a neck brace because it messed up my neck and head a lot. And I was out again for like a month. So I missed almost my whole 9th grade year. 10th grade came around, and I was out of sports completely. I started doing theater, which is also very fun. But I went on the bus, and it was icy out. It was winter. And we went on this icy road, and I was the only one to fly out my seat and land on my head in the middle of the row.
So even in theater, you bumped your head again.
It's just bad luck all around. But yeah, I hit my head again, and then I missed like 4 months of so I missed my 9th and 10th grade year completely. And since then, I've hit my head a lot more times. I've been rushed to the ER a few times after that too, but not as critical as some others, so a lot more than 5, sadly. And my symptoms pretty much have included headaches constantly and that cluster thing that she said. Yeah, that thing. And dizziness, forgetfulness, awful, just awful, and pretty much all those other symptoms that everybody's been saying.
Okay, well, as I've said many times, we wish you the best, and thank you for sharing your story. You're very brave to do it.
We have another young lady too.
Do we? Okay, well, we'll
Yes.
save that. We'll do that in just one moment, but I want to talk just briefly about some of these return-to-play guidelines and more framing as how do medical professionals, trained coaches really make that decision. So I think everyone in this room is in agreement that concussions are real things now, and they're serious, and we want to pick the right time for returning to normal life. How is that done?
Well, it's becoming more standardized. I'll start with there, and it's done interdisciplinary with a multiple team approach. I think that's the start. Most people in this country and internationally are doing kind of a graded return to play, where initially a patient or an athlete is largely symptomatic at rest in a relatively low stimulation environment, so not at the Mall of America or not at a 3D movie theater, but asymptomatic, in a routine stimulation environment. And then we try to add stimulation, not to try to encourage symptoms, but to kind of test them. Yeah. And then we exertionally test them both physically and mentally. And we're really looking to see, are they asymptomatic from their reporting? So them telling us and writing down maybe on a piece of paper or on a computer program and saying, hey, I feel good with my headache, I feel good with my forgetfulness, I feel good with all this stuff. And then we start exertionally testing them. If it's done like in a true athletic population, we're usually using either the school's athletic trainer or I have an athletic trainer that works with me. So we'll kind of use them together to say, hey, now let's take the test or let's do some physical exam findings after you doing some exercise. And so that system-wide kind of step-by-step approach has been done. So I usually use 3 things: the subjective reporting symptoms, a balance assessment or a balance testing, which is probably the best physical finding and most sensitive physical exam finding that I can use, and then usually some sort of neurocognitive assessment, which is really a big topic, but it can involve, and usually does involve in my clinic, a computerized neurocognitive test.
So what I'm hearing collectively here is that this is not an exact science.
It is not an exact science. It's different for every single person. The approach is standard pretty much for every single person, but the tailored results are different for every single person. And it does help to kind of use age-based standards to kind of compare it to. It's even a little bit better to have maybe that personal person standards on different tests, whether it be the exam from the balance or from a neurocognitive assessment, but we use standards to kind of compare. And then we ask family members, and we ask coaches, and we talk about observation.
I wanted to ask Dr. Smith, in Olivia's case, she's obviously someone who had especially a tough break, even in theater, hitting her head again. She's someone who needs to watch herself now. How do you advise kids in that situation to behave with their peers? Do you want to self-identify as someone who's susceptible to head injuries, or does that play into the stigma? I mean, is it good to let your fellow students know, like, hey, I have to watch myself here because I'm susceptible to this?
I think at this point that she really does have to protect herself. It's been so repetitive, and I think she's probably pretty open about your affiliation with this group and what a support they've been. And I think to let that be known and then to capitalize on her assets from there forward would be important. One thing I was just going to say about the return to play, one thing that's kind of difficult is that some of the rules were requiring a licensed healthcare provider, and they didn't specify, did they, very well, so that there's a lot of very accomplished athletic trainers and people like that would not have met those criteria. And then there's a lot of licensed providers that are maybe obstetricians or folks that wouldn't know the information that you've just heard described. So we're still working on those rules and regulations. They're not perfect yet.
Okay. And you pointed out that we have one more story. Is your name Kayla?
We do.
Okay,
Yeah.
Kayla, thanks. Stand up.
Yeah,
and the thing we should mention now is that the group that you mentioned that many of these students are members of is Connections for Concussions. Are you a member of that group as well? Maybe we'll get to your story in a second, but can you tell us a little bit about this group you guys have all decided to join?
Yeah, me and Matt are actually the co-founders, and we met at a meeting that was done through the Brain Injury Alliance with kids with concussions, and we got to talking and realized we had so much in common that we could relate on a level with, we actually understood each other because we had gone through the same stuff, we'd seen same doctors, had same symptoms, been on same medications, and it actually started as a joke, ha ha ha, let's start a support group. 4 months later, we started a support group, and that is almost 2 years ago, and we now have about 10 kids who come once a month, and we talk about stuff. Our parents go into a separate group, and the kids go into separate groups. So it's not just for the youth; it's also for the parents. And I think it's just good for all of us. We leave feeling better, and we all understand each other very well, and get a very good sense. We're kind of a little small family.
So it helps get you past that stigma. Maybe the folks in the world who don't believe you or think you're faking it.
Yep.
Having peers who have been through the same thing really is helping you out psychologically.
Definitely.
Okay, great. Tell us your story. What has been your experience with concussion?
I suffered 2 concussions 10 months apart in hockey. My first one, I was only out for not even a week, and they said I almost had a concussion. My second one, I actually didn't even remember I hit my head. My teammates, I was having a constant headache, and I actually left school early one day because I was having such a bad headache. And I told my teammates about it, that I had this headache, and I didn't know why. And they said, you hit your head at practice the other day. And then I remembered, and I actually played for 10 more days, which I know I shouldn't have.
Was that you being tough or not wanting to
That was
admit
me,
it? What was going through your head then?
My parents knew about it. The coaches knew about it. I just kept playing, saying, I want to be out there. I want to be with my teammates.
Because you love to play.
It's what I've been doing since I was 4. I started skating on my family pond with my older brother and my dad. Everybody on both sides of my family played. It was just a part of my life. So I kept playing for 10 days until we went to see a doctor, and he said I had concussion, and we need to sit out for 2 weeks. And I cried after this because hockey was my life, and that was almost 4 years ago. And since then, I have a constant headache. I'm fatigued. I'm very sensitive to noise. Sunlight, I have to wear sunglasses outside. I've missed a lot of school. My team abandoned me. I've lost a lot of friends, which is also another good thing why I have this group. I found a new, really good group of friends and have a new best friend, so.
Why do you think you had a tough relationship and lost friends on your team? Are they not maybe as educated on concussions? Was it news?
Part of it, well, I think part of it, I couldn't do things that normal teenagers can do. I think a lot of us can't do normal things that teenagers can anymore. We can't do like sleepovers. We can't do a lot of that normal stuff. We can't go to field trips. Half of us can't even make it to school. I thought people I hadn't seen for a couple months had moved because I just was so out of the loop. So I just think that was definitely a part of it. I would go to the games to be with my team even though I couldn't play, and I would end up in the locker room crying because my head would hurt so bad. So I think that was definitely part of it, but yeah.
Well, congratulations to you and good work on building a new community for helping rebuild those friendships. You're also a real go-getter in that in 2011, Minnesota passed a state law which is really influential in relation to concussions, and I heard you were involved in this. So I figured, why don't you, for our experts in our conversation, set up the 2011 state law. Tell us what it's all about.
Return to Play was a state law passed to just kind of help get some guidelines about kids with concussions, that they need to, and here comes my forgetfulness.
That's all right, take your time.
That they need to have a doctor's notice to come back to play. They need to sit out. I think they need to be 2 weeks symptom-free to come back to play. Coaches and I think trainers, referees need training, I think, every 2 years, and that they have the right to pull a kid or out of a game. I think that's the gist of it, Mom.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the description. You've done amazing things. And let's transition back to our excerpts really quick. Okay, so we have this new state law. Is it enough? Is it in the right direction? What's your analysis?
So I'm trying to think where I want to start. I mean, there's some amazing progress. Okay, so to kind of give a little bit more picture of nationally where these laws came from, Minnesota was one of many states that she was very influential in getting part of through our specific Congress. I mean, this came really from individual stories. So I think that one of the things to highlight from this is that not only we're listening to individual stories here, but individual stories is how legislation happens. And so this is a 100% salute to her and her family of trying to get this through. It's huge. It's not perfect. Nothing's perfect in legislation, I don't think, maybe except for the Constitution. But that's pretty much it.
That's a whole separate show.
That's a whole separate show. So initially came back in the state of Washington. One of my mentors certainly was part of that. And
Stan Herring.
And his name is Dr. Stan Herring. And there was a specific gentleman named Zachary who was kind of one of the the athletes that suffered a very severe traumatic brain injury. And so there's been a lot of movement and legislation of different statewide levels. So this is piggybacks off many of the previous other state laws. I agree with pretty much all of it. I mean, there's not much to disagree about. It's in application, it becomes difficult sometimes. So it's application of laws where things sometimes get tough. I think that the need for getting someone that's qualified to return someone to play is huge, and Dr. Smith touched on it a little bit. That law is vague. It's very hard to say to people that have been practicing for 20, 30 years, and all of a sudden say now they can't see athletes because of this. That's tough. Doesn't mean that it might not be the correct thing to do, but there are certain healthcare providers that might not be able to do this, and there's certain healthcare providers that might be able to, and it's very hard to legislate and say who's in or who's out. That's not just in the state of Minnesota, it's nationally. But pretty much everything else is a wonderful piece. I'm not, the part about 2 weeks, I don't want to nitpick your remembering of the law. The part about 2 weeks is not, I mean, there's not a symptomatic 2 week crossover. There's not like, oh, there's a line here for 2 weeks. Because like as I previously just talked a little bit about, figuring out if someone's really asymptomatic is something that's a little bit of a challenge to really say when is someone.
It's hard to quantify in law.
It's hard to quantify when someone's asymptomatic because my test might be different than your test and her test, and so it's hard. But the gist of the law is wonderful.
So, Dr. Smith, your reactions to the law?
Yeah, I feel the same way. I think it's great what you've done, and this is a huge beginning. And like anything, it'll get amended a little bit and so on. Just to make sure that if you look around here, you can find qualified physicians that can clear you very easily. But in little tiny communities, there may just be a nurse practitioner, or there may just be as I said, an obstetrician or something like that, and they may not be ready to make those decisions. So I think there's some wiggle room, and I think people have already addressed some of those.
And one of the great things of the law that you touched on is that there's education that's required. That's national from the CDC to coaches and officials. That's a huge part too, because their observations, their eyes and ears. I am not around nearly as much as parents. I'm never going to be. I'm just one person. And so that's huge. And then the understanding, what she was kind of piggybacking on, is that about 50% of high schools in this state, I don't know other state quotes of, have an athletic trainer that work at it. And that's a little low, actually, nationally. And so when you have a designated, nonpartisan person that's looking at this, that's not a conflict of interest, and parents have a conflict of interest, coaches have a conflict of interest, officials may or may not, depending on if you believe that all officiating is well done.
Another show proposed here.
We got 3 shows. But I mean, I think that's a huge step, and that's a huge thing that I think would be important, of having a athletic trainer that's at certain games with higher risk. But that's a financial problem. It's a very difficult problem to tackle.
Our hour is going really quickly, and there's a few more voices I wanted to get in. Obviously, these injuries impact more than just the students who experience them. There's the parents. And we have Janet here tonight, who's Michelle's mom. Janet, okay, I'm going to come all the way around to your side. And you expressed some frustration that the only advice you got from pediatricians, I'm going to squeeze in next to you here, was to take rest, and that was it. What was your experience?
After the initial diagnosis, we were told rest, both physical and cognitive rest. Well, after about a week of that, she still had her headache. She still had all the other symptoms. And I didn't know what to do next. I was kind of sitting there. I ended up calling my chiropractor I had talked to, asking her for help. Is there a place that, or is there something we can set up that people know what to do next? I mean, I have my support group now, but for those that don't have it, is there something we can tell them?
Yeah. That's just what we were talking about, is that people have almost taken the approach, above all, do no harm. So rest, rest, rest. And we're just on the cusp, I think, of having some really maybe outcome data for some of the kinds of things that you're speaking about, like perhaps chiropractic. Definitely some of this vestibular work that's being done is starting to look as though it has some outcomes. I mean, somebody like Sidney Crosby's traveled all over the place and has sort of found something, whether it's really that intervention that's helped or whether the tincture of time was such that, the healing was beginning nicely. So we're really trying to make a difference. And I think one other thing, could I mention, we were talking about the difficulty of diagnosis. And we're looking at some research right now on a Halifax consciousness scanner. And it could be any one of a number of scanners, but they're like EEGs that we're going to be able to actually use on the sideline at the rink in about 5 minutes. And while the questions are being asked, this EEG will give us the equivalent of what an electrocardiogram did. Back in my day, if somebody came in with an MI, a heart attack, nobody really knew, and they didn't, you know, until they put electrocardiogram on, and then they could see how much, whereabouts in the heart muscle, and so on. So we're trying to move toward that, so that not only will the diagnosis be made properly, but people like Doc here will have an idea maybe of how it's quantified, where in the brain, and this sort of thing. And then I think we'll also have some better base to put outcomes of different therapies. So I totally applaud and appreciate the need to look around for something other than rest. And we're trying to move forward on exercise.
How about for the parent after the concussion has happened and they really have a lot of questions? What resources to that point? What's the call you can make? Where can you go for information? Who can you reach out to?
CDC or your sports center, like for USA Hockey, if you're a hockey player, there's a fair bit on. Hockey Canada has a lot on. But definitely CDC. Facts are compartmentalized into parent, coach, and so on. So I think those, and there's a wonderful book called Concussions, A Silent Epidemic. Have you all seen it? Do you agree? It's helpful, isn't it? There's a lot of stories there that are very similar, and it's written by objective reporters, and so they're telling us a lot of information we need to.
Okay. Well, let me ask you, Janet, as a parent, how are you feeling with the ongoing symptoms of someone you obviously love more than anybody? What's been the emotional progression for yourself?
It's been pretty tough because I would do whatever I could to make her better. And I mean, I did a lot of Google searching and I found the CDC website.
Good. Okay.
And in fact, the doctor's note back to the school said return to play as per CDC requirements.
Okay.
Which I thought was kind of funny because I brought him up to him.
Yeah.
But I've been looking everywhere, whether it's through regular medical ways or more of the alternative medicines.
Yes.
And whatever I can try and find, we'll try it.
Yeah.
And I think we've come a long way. We've made a lot of progress. And this has been a better year this year.
Go girl.
Her headaches are still there, but she's returned to dance, which is the biggest thing in her life.
Yeah.
And we're hoping that we can keep moving forward.
Great.
So.
Well, thank you for sharing your story. I really appreciate it. We have another mom here who I did want to get into the conversation. Hannah's mom, Susan. Over here? Okay, I'll squeeze over here further. Same question. How has your life been in relation to your daughter's injury?
I think not only watching someone you love be hurt so badly and to watch sorry, I get emotional and think about it. But it's also a loss for the parents as well, because not only have we lost the stability in our lives, every day I don't know if she's going to go to school or can we go to the Renaissance Festival or how is she feeling. But you also lose part of your social networking. Many of us were sports parents. We traveled with those parents. We spent every weekend with those parents. And we lose our social life as well. It's gone. And people don't check in, and that's okay. They've moved on. But it's a grieving process, not only for watching your child lose who they were, at least temporarily, but you've also lost who you were. I'm no longer a soccer mom, and that's what I'd been since my kids were age 4. I'm no longer a basketball mom. And so that's been a hard thing. But the amazing thing about our support group is you find other things, and Hannah's become very much an outspoken advocate, as many of our kids have, on the prevention and not to give up sports, but to let their bodies heal. And so now, I may not be a soccer mom, but I'm a really proud mom of an advocate. And so, honestly, that's an amazing thing to be as well.
So what we're obviously hearing here is that a concussion can cause dominoes that affect more than just the people who experience the concussion. Are there any emerging other support groups like this one? Is the psychological impact on the family being more recognized than maybe it has been in the past? Thank you, by the way.
I think it's recognized. I mean, I think that it's recognized. That does not mean that there's resources. I think that there's a huge shortage of researchers. It doesn't mean it's not recognized, but the amount of known resources come directly from shows like this, from webinars like this, from stories like this, from laws like this, and that's where this comes from. It doesn't come from I mean, I like to think I'm a good person. I like to think that Dr. Smith's a good person. I like to think that we try to make a difference in patients' lives, but it doesn't come from healthcare providers as much as it comes from individuals. And I think that's why I'm here. That's why I think Dr. Smith is here. That's why I think it's important that I hope so much that people hear this and they do only encourage this. You should have a huge booming population of your network of people. I mean, this kind of stuff is so needed, but it's very difficult for myself to personally to create just because of the things that I'm doing all day, other things as well. I know that sounds like a massive excuse, but it's a recognition of what my place of this crisis is.
But you're seeing so many patients in your practice on a daily basis, whereas I can work with a lot of programs on prevention and research on it, and I'm able to do that. One of the hiatuses that I thought was being addressed, but the kids can tell me if I'm right or wrong, isn't it awfully hard for you to know when to write exams that are things like college entrance exams or exams that test you? Is everybody with me on this? Is there a resource now for that? There is something, isn't there?
Well, what I have, it's called like, we're allowed.
I should move the mic over here, actually. I won't be able to hear you otherwise. Go ahead.
Well, at my school, with me, like people who have problems with testing or brain injuries, we are allowed to go to different rooms, like private rooms, either for more time, quieter space, or even help, like we get to take notes. When I first started getting concussions, there was nothing like that. So it took like over a year to finally get something developed.
Exactly.
Now it's gotten a lot better where there's a lot more help in my school, and there's definitely help for me better now. It used to be not like this, but I think because people are becoming more involved in everything, it's definitely more.
And you know, one thing I'd just like to say in support of all this too is that there's so much stuff that we honestly do know and that we can all do better. Like on Saturday, for example, we're having a safety hockey clinic down in Rochester. It's our second one. We're doing it with the hockey organizations in town. And there's stations that the kids will rotate through. And there'll be coaches on the ice for 4 on-ice stations and 4 off. But it's about heads up, don't duck. Do you know what I mean? When you're going in toward the boards, you've got to practice that. You remember that. There's just the strengthening. We know of differences in between boys and girls can get better neck strength. And you mentioned anticipation, and there's nothing more important. If you see a hit coming and you can brace that upper body, and if you've got some significant musculature, there's a good chance that you will not have that open ice hit that we see on the hockey ice or on the football field. There's big differences in football with concussions based on what position you play because of those risks of just what we're talking about. So there's a lot we can do, not just by you leaving your practice, you can't, but your athletic trainers, do you know what I mean, and your strength and conditioning coaches, we can make this a better world for kids because we need kids to be active, don't we?
I don't want to cut you off, but there's one more story I really want to get to, and we're almost out of time, and that's John Basil. John, are you here today? Okay, John, my understanding is that your daughter has had 3 concussions now, and you as a family have really struggled with the decision about whether she should still be active in sports. Can you tell us a little bit about your story?
Yeah, she had 3 concussions, all in hockey. And the last one in hockey was a pretty severe one, and I think as she went through the rehabilitation, which was about a month out of school, a month part-time, and then a month, and then, you know, she was fortunate. When I hear some of the stories, I could really see her returning, as you talked about, Doctor, about looking at the symptoms. You could see her coming back to being asymptom-free. But then the tough decision is, do you allow them to play again, knowing that there's risk out there? And I think you know, we went back and forth as a family, strong desire from her to play. That's probably an understatement, like most of the kids. Very strong desire to play, but I think it's that emotional piece. It's the friends. It's the story that, you know, Mom and Dad, that's where all my friends are. My friends are on the team, and I'm not, I don't want to give that up. And I think that's the part that kind of went, kind of put us over the barrier to say, you know, we're going to allow her to play again, and she was released in June, about 6 months after her last concussion.
How has it been for you as a father watching these games now, knowing that there's this history here and the science of repeat injuries?
Yeah, it's, you know, she returned her first varsity game was not in hockey, but soccer this fall at a competitive level. And I can tell you that I've gone to all 5 of her soccer games. And yeah, I'm a little nervous. I mean, every time she goes to, there's a lot of people, there's a little scrum, the ball's coming in, there's a corner kick, there's a bunch of people going up. Yeah, you get nervous. You do.
Well, thank you for sharing your story. I really appreciate it, John.
But the depression is so awful that the kids are going through. We actually published a paper on 6 kids with injury who attempted suicide because of being left out, that horrible alienation kind of feeling. Not one of them was successful, thankfully, and they weren't specific to concussions. But when you're gone and that peer group is lost to you and that exercise is lost to you, it's just horrible during those years, isn't it? So we're proud of you guys and what you're doing. What a positive way to deal with it, you know?
We are almost out of time, but I had one last question to sort of sum up here. We have, I think, a greater awareness. I mean, the media is now talking about this. We're having conversations like this one. Groups are forming. There's a state law. Where do both of you perceive as the next big push or the next big step? What has to be the focus now that we've done so much? Where do we go from here?
You know, I'm really into the research, honestly. I'm looking for outcomes in about 10 different kinds of research protocols, and I feel like we're just getting closer and closer to some answers. And I've kind of alluded to some of what they might be, but you weigh in on what you think.
I'm not into research. I'm into practical application and interpretation of research, and trying to deal with. So my answer to your question would be culture change and the persistent desire to have safer sports. I don't know I truly don't know the number of athletes that we can prevent from having a concussion, but I want to try. And I don't know how many patients that we can prevent from going from a normal 1 to 2 week recovery to a 6-month recovery, but that's the part I want to try. So we're trying to use culture change detection to keep all concussions numbers down, but then also reducing protracted concussions. So that's early intervention, that's patient, that's athlete, that's family, that's coach, that's official, that's healthcare provider, early reportation of the situation, and then tailoring an early treatment approach to each of those concussions. So I have multiple primary care doctors that come up to me, that refer to me, and they're all, they're pediatricians, and as being kind of like the hub. I'm kind of the hub in Health Partners, and they'll say, when do you want to see my kid? I have a kid with a concussion. How quickly do you want to see it? And my answer is always yesterday, because patient education is the day. I mean, that's what we're doing. We're trying to educate patients and families to try to tailor that specific concussion to try to get them not be prolonged and protracted like many of the athletes here today.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Hofkens, Dr. Smith. Thank you so much for your time. Let's give a big round of applause to all the brave students here today for sharing their story. Thank you so much for your time, and best of luck in the future. Remember to watch the full Twin Cities Public Television program debuting right after the Frontline documentary on Tuesday, October 8th. And if you'd like more information before then, it's all on our website at tpt.org/concussions. I'm David Gillette. Thanks very much for watching.